We are at a pivotal moment in Canadian real estate. US tariffs are back in the headlines all over again. And with bond yields creeping back up, inflation is far from settled right now. And all of this is creating serious pressure on Canadian real estate and prices. It seems like there's only two directions we could go right now: right back up or straight down to the pits. Now, this isn't just a local market story. This is Canadian real estate nationwide. And while there are certain subsets and certain cities that are experiencing more upwards pressure than downwards pressure, this couldn't feel more pivotal than what it has in the last couple of weeks. So, I'm going to break down for you right now in the next 20 minutes, specifically the reasons why we could be falling off the cliff or why we might just be coming back for the save and things evening out for the rest of 2025. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to dive right in. Let's get started. This is not another market cycle. This is such a big moment in Canadian real estate, and it can absolutely change how generations of Canadians decide to live and invest. And I truly believe that's the case. All right, so I'm going to cover for you guys the 5 reasons why the market could completely collapse and change real estate for the next generation of Canadians, and why we might be on a road to recovery, which a lot of people, specifically in the last week, have felt might be the case. Depending on where you're located, you think I'm crazy, or you absolutely agree with every single thing that I'm saying. But let's get right into the 5 reasons that the market could actually break down and falter. And everything I'm talking about here today, I have presented with data and information because I know you guys love that stuff. But let's get right into it. So number one, the same thing that's been in the news for the better part of the last couple of months at this point right now. We're sitting in May of 2025, and that is the US tariffs, something that no one really cares to talk about anymore, but we must talk about it. The US tariffs could fuel inflation and really push prices back up because we've really not felt the brunt of them until what looks to be the next couple of weeks going into the second half of May of 2025. In fact, none of the reports that we've seen in Canada have really seen or felt the data yet of tariffs in the marketplace. BMO itself predicts that the tariffs could lift U.S. inflation in the United States, that is, by up to 4% by the end of 2025. And we need to remember that higher U.S. inflation equals higher U.S. bond yields, which typically puts pressure on Canadian bond yields to head right back up, which means higher fixed mortgage rates. Even if the BOC itself continues cutting on the overnight rate, this could mean that the fixed interest rate market continues to go up. And while we've seen those yields go up, it also decreases the discounts that we're seeing on variable rates, so discounts on prime, which could ultimately mean even if the BOC cut rates, there's not much of a reduction in variable rates, and there's an increase in fixed rate mortgages. And number 2, this was interesting. I was reading a study today about how long it takes to save money for a down payment on a Canadian home. And I feel like this is probably an episode on its own. And interestingly enough, 2025 compared to 2022, shockingly, because when you think about this, a lot of people don't realize that in 2021, 2022, interest rates were very low, house prices were very high. So it actually would have taken way longer to save money for a down payment in 21, 22. And so we've actually seen that come right back down significantly. It's still not low. I mean, for example, in British Columbia, the average timeline to save 20% for a home for the average Canadian is 7.5 years. Now, you can compare that to other cities or other provinces across the country, like PEI and New Brunswick, where it's actually only 2 to 3 years. Saskatchewan, where it's only 2 to 3 years to do so. It's generally speaking very difficult to believe that the average Canadian could ever save 20% down on a home in a 10-year time frame, given the cost of living and expenses in the marketplace. But believe it or not, these studies were based on net income, based on the average Canadian income tax earner in the country. The Desjardins article that I was reading specifically states it takes 72 months of saving 20% of your income to afford the average down payment on a home. That is a long time, ladies and gentlemen. And if you are not getting help from a family member, you might think it's nearly impossible. I will say this, though. This is based on the average house price and an average home, which doesn't think about the fact that the average Canadian first-time buyer is not buying the average home. They're usually starting in a starter home. And so that number should probably be closer to 30 months or something in that nature when you consider dropping the price back down. But with that being said, the average person's age or first-time buyer's age, crazy enough, is almost 40 years old, which means by 40, they probably have one or two kids, or maybe they do have some kids on the way, which would mean that what they were looking for in a starter home is also more expensive. So lots to consider there. For a lot of people, it's no longer about buying a home. It's whether or not they'll actually ever even have one or own a home. I mean, affordability is no longer about monthly payments. It's the front door itself that is actually locked, which means literally getting the down payment for most Canadians is the biggest concern. Now, I, for one, do believe that to a degree there is certainly a reality of that, but I also believe that most people could spend, the average Canadian does not spend the time or energy on coming up with a plan early enough in their lives to be able to own a home. And I've seen first-time buyers who literally were 20 years old and were able to buy by 23, 24 years old and so forth. But it really comes down to a situation where the sooner you start, the sooner you're going to get there in reality. Now, the third reason that we could see the market fall off a cliff is because sales are collapsing in some key markets. Now, I will specify these are some key markets. The GTA, Greater Toronto Area, sales are down 53% year over year in May of 2025. There was virtually no sales spring market in Greater Toronto Area and Vancouver. But could we chalk that up to the election and the fear over the tariffs in the beginning? Hard to say. Maybe we'll see a late spring market. But right now, a 50% decline in purchases is a significant number and a huge impact to the marketplace. In addition to that, Canadian Real Estate Association says that sales are 7.5% below the 10-year average, despite some modest price drops. So despite the fact that house prices are falling in many key areas, we've still seen 7.5% less. So even with prices dipping, buyers are still staying sidelined. And the reason why, actually, people don't know, because generally speaking, the market believes that rates themselves are probably close to, if not at the quote unquote bottom, and are probably going to start going up in the next 12 months based on what we said before. So a lot of this probably has to do with buyer confidence. And I've seen it myself in the marketplace on a day-to-day basis. Many people are saying things like, I'm going to wait to see, wait to see, wait to see. You ask why, and they don't really give you a particular reason. And so the marketplace basically just has a limited amount of confidence. Now, that's not to say that no one's buying, but just there is a big dip. The fourth reason, my apologies, is that mortgage delinquencies are quietly creeping up. Now, let's be honest, folks, we're not seeing houses getting foreclosed on the block by block basis, but there is a reality to some of these situations where we're seeing real estate foreclosures. RBC's 30-plus day delinquency rate hit 0.47%. Again, this is a half of a 1%, which is still very minimal, very, very minimal, but it is the highest of the big six, which makes you wonder if RBC will be reassessing their mortgage qualification guidelines probably in the near future. This gets a little bit more complex, but the covered bond delinquency rate is 0.29%, which is up 0.08% year over year, which basically says we're not seeing a default wave at this point right now, but it's the kind of slow uptick that could come and be before we see a wave of defaults. Now, if you're on the negative side of the ledger, you probably think that we're going to see foreclosures galore. We're certainly going to see more of them as there are more renewals and the cost of living keeps going up in Canada. And if we lose more jobs, it could be the perfect storm. But is it really something where we see this happen on, is it going to be 3 out of 100 homes or 4 out of 100 homes? Probably not, but we'll wait and see. There we go. Number fifth reason that we could see real estate fall off a cliff is that inventory is climbing in its most valuable markets. Vancouver has the most listings that we've seen since 2013. That is 12 years. That's a significant time, particularly in light of the last number of years with interest rates being where they are. That's a significant consideration. National inventory, it has 5.06 months of inventory right now, which is over a 10-year average of 4.15 months of inventory. Basically, more listings and flat demand equals pressure on prices, especially in some of these major condo-heavy markets. So remember this, though. This is subject to specific areas and property types, and it is certainly not everywhere, especially based on the anecdotal feedback I'm receiving from agents in cities and communities where there is still high demand. It's just dependent on the locations. The risk going forward will be if the average number of people trying to sell homes turns into a large number of people who have to sell, This is the serious risk that would have a major implication on the market falling off a cliff. So now that you're in this negative mindset and you think the market's going to fall off a cliff, and everybody watching the YouTube and listening to my podcast who thinks the prices are going to crash is probably cheering and agreeing with everything I had to say, let's talk about the 5 reasons that the market could recover. Now, I'm not going to go out here and suggest that the market is in for a boom in 2025, but notably speaking, the last couple of weeks or the first couple of weeks of May have seen a major uptick compared to virtually all of April and some of March. And is that a short-term blip while people lead into the summer months? Or are we starting to see confidence coming back is a question that I don't have the answer for. But let's talk a little bit about the reasons that the market might just come back and or pick back up. Number one, the rate cycle itself has still, believe it or not, just started. We've cut interest rates. The BOC's cut interest rates over the course of the last 8 months, and it just finally stalled in April for the first time in a long time. And the reality is right now, inflation expectations at 2.2% and 2.1% in 2025 and 2026 are on the low side. With the overnight target of 2%, there's not a lot of expectations right now that inflation is going to go through the roof, although some suggest otherwise. There's a perception warning that the BOC may be a bit too dovish in this scenario, but softer inflation could justify more easing in the marketplace, meaning BOC could cut rates even lower if they see more easing in inflation. We could see the BOC cut rates another 0.5 to 0.75% in the next 12 months if the market and inflation plays nice. Obviously, a lot of outside influence here, but it is a reality of what could happen in this marketplace. The second big one is the question around, is Canada still underbuilding? And if Canada is building, are they building the right type of product in the marketplace? CMHC still says we're short 3.5 million homes by 2030. That's significant. And while May expectations beat the target at 279K versus 228K homes being built, that's more of a blip in the marketplace. We haven't seen that as a trend. And in fact, on the trend line, we're still downwards with that just breaking the recent trend line. So unless that becomes a regular occurrence, it's again, probably a situation where we're underbuilding, and a reminder that we're building the wrong type of properties. And the suggestion is that we build these manufactured homes, which I'm still trying to figure out. So even in a slowdown, we're not building fast enough to keep up with demand, and investors are not getting the deposits that they have and they require to start building and pre-building properties for the next 3-5 years, which is where we're going to feel some of the pain in the marketplace as it relates to supply. Interestingly enough, the third one is that immigration keeps the floor under our demand. And yes, we've heard that we're going to see a reduced amount of inflation, but let's talk about this. 485,000 new permanent residents were expected in 2024 of that report, which means that many are landing in the major markets with tight rental supply and low resale listings. And while they're not getting all absorbed right now, it's only a matter of time where the market starts to absorb that back up. Immigration, unsurprisingly, is Canada's not so secret weapon against or for the housing, resilience in our marketplace. Basically saying that between our immigration and our lack of building, those two could continue to create a supply crunch, not necessarily like we saw in 22 or 21, but it'll continue to put pressure upwards on the marketplace. Now, number 4 is the mortgage arrears. So foreclosures and missing payments are still historically low. We talked about this in the previous segment about how RBC suggested that their numbers are at 0.47%. But despite those increases at RBC and BMO, we're still under 0.3% nationally, which is still incredibly and historically low. So that's not a reason for the market to take off. And it suggests that most homeowners still have a significant amount of equity. In fact, the Financial Post posted an article just over the last few days talking about how homeowners have more wealth than they've ever had before in their homes, which is another reminder that people will probably refinance or get second mortgages before they will go ahead and foreclose on properties. Number 5, policy support is creeping back in. Let's break this down specifically. We're going to see more interventions if we do see more defaults in the marketplace. Okay. The government as a whole has a history of stepping in situations where there is some foreclosure or if there are risks of the market falling off a cliff. The second Ottawa sees any stress in the data, they're going to go in and grease the wheels again. And that is going to cause the marketplace to pick right back up. And we don't know what that would look like, but as it relates to history, generally speaking, Canadians and the Canadian government don't want to see the collapse. In fact, the new housing minister, Gregor Robertson, came out publicly and did not deny that he wants house prices to stay the same or go back up. When asked if he expected house price to go down, he basically avoided the question, but inadvertently suggested that house prices should remain the same or go higher, which will be welcome news for all the baby boomers out there, but not so good for all those hoping for a housing crash. Now, interestingly enough, I read a quote from BMO Economics that said that 3.99% rates are not low enough to trigger a lot of activity because buyers are nostalgic for the 2%. And I've seen that in my own business. People take it as almost like a rite of passage that mortgage rates are going to be 2% forever. And that's just simply not the case. We saw it for a blip for a few years during COVID and a few years in the late teens. But again, there's no reason, historically speaking, for that to happen. In fact, the 25-year average cost of mortgage rates is over 4.59%, and we are below that average. There's no reason to believe that we're going to continue going down unless there is some other action of major significance. I do not believe we are in a major housing bubble. I believe that we have a pressure test right now, and we're in the middle of it. Canadian real estate, as you know, is resilient. It's bending like crazy, but I don't think we're in a position where it is going to break. And the next few months could tip us towards recovery, or obviously we could be looking at a real correction as it relates to the marketplace. But if you look at a graph of real estate, again, we haven't seen that cliff really fall off. There are certain things that I'm looking out for as it relates to what could happen in the marketplace, with the first one being US inflation and the tariffs. Obviously, that will have a massive impact on our marketplace, and we've yet to see what that will mean for the Canadian consumer and Canadian real estate in reality. The second thing I'm going to be looking for is Canadian job market stability. With those tariffs, with what happens in the US, that will impact our marketplace. Do we gain more jobs, or do we see jobs fall off a cliff with people losing them? Because that will impact the marketplace. And the last one, which I talked about in my previous video or YouTube or podcast, if you listen to it, was all about mortgage renewals. Now, if you haven't listened to that, I highly suggest you go back to the previous episode and listen to the conversation about mortgage renewals. That one was a big one, and it was significant because I walked through what could happen and if we are really worried about a debt cliff in the mortgage renewal marketplace. Of course, if you have a mortgage renewal, something to go back and check out. If you found that this information helped you to understand specifically what was happening, I want you, if you're on YouTube, to click subscribe. And if you're listening to the podcast, leave me a great review and send this forward to someone else. If you're looking for mortgage or strategic advice on your mortgage, then hit me up at Flow Mortgage Co. at themortgagepug or getflowmortgage.ca. We focus primarily on strategic real estate moves for our existing clients and making better decisions. Thank you so much for listening to the episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.